In 2016, Philippine President Rodrigo Duterte made a dramatic shift in the nation's foreign policy. He pivoted towards China to receive billions of dollars in pledged Chinese investments.
He talks about how important China is for economic health in the Philippines, even though China continues to not deliver any economic goods.
4 years on, only a fraction of China's promised investments has materialized.
They're taking Duterte for a ride. He has done a lot for China, and yet, what did he get from China in exchange? Up until today, there are practically zero big-ticket infrastructure projects by China.
China is cognizant that Duterte is not in office forever. They're probably holding some of that money back and thinking we need to keep these as goodies to dangle in front of Duterte's successor to try and get leverage over whoever that is.
President Duterte's brazen pro-China stance has triggered a backlash in the country. Will he succumb to domestic criticism and recalibrate his foreign policy?
I don't see him even attempting to cross China. China, as far as Duterte is concerned, is a lifeline.
He is hugely popular in the Philippines, ardently loved by his supporters, and intensely loathed by his critics.
I would describe him as an authoritarian populist and someone who comes with a sort of very deeply ingrained ideology. And certainly when it comes to the West and the US in particular, he has this what you might call a sort of anti-imperialist view of the US and the West more broadly, and I think that informs his foreign policy.
I think Duterte is a symptom of a fundamental problem in the Philippines, including the fact that we have had dysfunctional democracy. We have had presidents, one after the other, who are too much aligned to the United States, sometimes at the expense of the Philippine interest. So in some way, he has been a symptom of those deficiencies, and in some ways, he has tried to be a corrective to that, but unfortunately, his own gamble has also been a disaster in many ways, both for Philippine democracy and for the Philippines' national interest.
Internationally, Duterte has largely received negative attention. He has been accused of ordering indiscriminate extrajudicial killings as part of his war on drugs, a cornerstone of his presidency. Yet, domestically, he enjoys popular support, even in the face of widespread criticism of his pivot to China policy. How is Duterte so popular, and what makes him tick?
He comes from the slums, but he has this kind of Hollywood looks. By some account, he's a favorite for the presidency in 2022, where he decided to run. He is the most influential Filipino political figure online, so he's doing very strong.
The population is very firmly pro-US. The fascinating thing we've seen during Duterte's time in office is, if you like, this ability of voters to compartmentalize their love of Duterte on the one hand and their dislike of his pivot to China on the other. And if you look at the poll numbers, his China policy to date has not really affected his overall poll numbers.
As to Duterte's record high popularity rating of 91%. What has been happening in the Philippines, really, with respect to the pandemic, is that people are living under an atmosphere of fear that at any time they could be denied services, simply locked down, and kept from being supplied basic necessities. Add to that, the impact of the drug war. So many people really are living under a climate of fear.
Duterte's ambitious Build, Build, Build program is the centerpiece of his administration. With China's funding, it was set to usher in the golden age of infrastructure in the Philippines. 4 years have elapsed since China pledged $24 billion in investment to the Philippines. 27 deals were signed, but very little has materialized. What happened to the billions that China promised?
They're only doing enough in a way to keep Duterte happy. The 24 billion was the original package. Less than $1 billion of that has actually come to fruition.
They're taking Duterte for a ride. He has done a lot for China, and yet, what did he get from China in exchange? Up until today, there are practically zero big-ticket infrastructure projects by China in the implementation phase. There are some discussions about a Chinese dam project, but we don't even know if it will really kick off or how large it's going to be.
One of the big-ticket investments, the Kaliwa Dam project, includes a series of dams which have been projected as a solution to Manila's water woes. The project in its entirety comprises 3 dams that will serve nearly 20 million people in Manila and its surrounding regions. It falls under the Philippines' involvement in China's Belt and Road Initiative. Duterte's supporters argue that the country needs infrastructure and China has the cash to fund it. But why has the project not got off the ground yet?
Compliance with all of the safeguards that the Philippines has for all of these international development projects. Things like safeguards against corruption, requirements for social acceptability, requirements for minimum Philippine labor, no? Things like that, as well as the financial requirements. No? After all, the Philippines needs these projects to be financially viable. No? So China has not been able to comply with all of these stringent requirements.
There are technical bureaucratic constraints on the Philippine side that have slowed down projects, but we know that Japanese in particular and other projects have moved ahead. So this is not something that's affecting all projects. The other is that China has taken quite a hard negotiating line on these projects, by which I mean it is holding out on negotiations on financing costs to make sure that these projects are commercially worthwhile for China to do.
A part of the Kaliwa Dam project straddles the boundary of Rizal and Quezon provinces to the east of Manila. 44-year-old Alejandro Alex Tablo is one of the oldest residents of Daraitan village in Rizal province. Alex works as a community mediator and has been residing in this village since 1976. Daraitan is a little piece of heaven at the heart of the nation's longest Sierra Madre mountain range. But a heavy rainfall can spell doom for residents here.
Na talagang ang lugar po dito ay mapanganib po yung aming ilog pagka nagbabaha. Pag po lumalaki, halos po ang ilog ay halos lumubog po ang aming barangay Daraitan. Kaya po ang mga tao dito natatakot pagka nag-uulan, nagbabagyo po. Hindi nga po malaman kung saan pupunta. Gawa ng yan pong ilog ang kinatatakutan. Kasi po kung hangin-hangin lang, medyo wala pong masyadong problema kasi nandyan lang yan. Ay yung tubig po, dinala ka na ng hangin, dinala ka pa ng tubig, eh sana po pupulutin. Siyempre, matatabunan po yan ng mga kapag hindi po nakuha, tatabunan po yan ng mga layak.
The project can damage the environment considerably as the area of construction is deemed a protected area. This is one of the most biodiverse areas of the Philippines. The dam will negatively impact the ecosystem, but most importantly, it will affect livelihoods.
Ang kahilingan lang po namin, wag sanang lumubog yung barangay Daraitan kasi talaga pong nakakaawa yung mga nakatira doon na nagpundar ng kabuhayan.
43-year-old Melody Alao works as a tour guide in Daraitan, earning around $8 every weekend. It helps her send her 18-year-old daughter to school. The beautiful Tinipak River, surrounded by lush forests and rock formations, is a main tourist attraction. With the construction of Kaliwa Dam, this area risks being submerged. When that happens, Melody will be one of the first to lose her livelihood.
Apektado po talaga ang turismo. Hindi lang po tour guide ang umaasa sa turismo dito sa aming lugar. Transportasyon, karinderya, maglalako ng ice candy ng mga kabataan, mga vendor na naglalako po ng mga gloves, kapote, ganyan po. Malaki po talaga ang magiging epekto sa amin nung sinasabing Kaliwa Dam. Pero kahit ano pong tutol ang gawin namin, wala na po kami sigurong magagawa. Maliban lang po sa ilang kahilingan namin dito sa aming lugar.
The Kaliwa Dam, according to activists here, disregards the rights of indigenous peoples and local communities. The government has been engaging with the indigenous community and seeking their consent to the construction. But Alex laments that the process is not inclusive.
Ay sa akin pong palagay, talaga pong kami aabutin ng tubig. Sa akin lang po, ayaw ko po yung sa kuwan ng iba, pero sa tagal ko nga po dito, at saka yung pong sinasabi nila na hindi raw naman lalaki sapagkat pupunta ng Maynila ang tubig. Okay, yun nga pupuntang dagat eh. Ang tubig namin, halos lumubog po kami ay. Yun po, hindi po naman makakasapat yung takbo po Maynila kasi yan ibaha eh. Kaya po yun ang isang problema talaga ng Barangay Daraitan. Ay tutol nga po ako sa paggagawa ng Kaliwa Dam. Ay tumutol man po ako ay kung itutuloy, wala po akong magagawa.
Daraitan will serve as the reservoir for the Kaliwa Dam, expected to be completed over 5 years. The construction of the dam and its subsequent operation will require the relocation of over 1,000 families living here, resulting in severe disruption to their livelihoods.
Yes po yung Kaliwa Dam, Kaliwa Agus River, ay kailangan po ay meron kami magandang maayos na pupuntahan. Mahirap naman po yung pananagutan po nila sa aming mga nakatira dito. Bukod po sa akin, sa mga taong nakatira dito sa Barangay Daraitan, ay dapat po isaayos. Lagyan kung ano pong maganda, kung halimbawa, bibigyan nila ng magandang paglilipatan.
In November 2018, Philippine President Duterte welcomed his Chinese counterpart, Xi Jinping, for a state visit in Manila.
Philippines, this is more than a reciprocal visit. It is a historic occasion.
It was the first time from a Chinese president in 13 years.
我这次的访问呢，应该说是中非我们交往的一个历史性的一个交往。
The visit gave new hope that the nation of 106 million will finally receive a massive funding from China worth $24 billion. It was touted as the best option for upgrading the country's crumbling infrastructure. But so far, only a trickle of that funding has arrived.
Forget about Chinese debt trap. This is Chinese chimera. This is an illusion that they have used in order to extract concessions from China. So Duterte kind of looks like a fool, to be honest. And that has been used by the defense establishment to say, hey, we're not getting much love from China. The Americans, they may be imperfect allies, but they're the best insurance policy we got. So maybe we need to make an adjustment.
It's now painfully clear that Duterte has gotten nothing for this obsequious foreign policy. He hasn't gotten large amounts of Chinese aid and investment. He has kowtowed before the emperor, and he's received nothing in exchange for it. And that's just bad politically for him or his successor. It makes him look objectively weak.
The controversial Kaliwa Dam construction project remains a priority for the Duterte administration. It has, however, been stalled by protests from communities that could be potentially affected. The head of the Daraitan community and a government official feels that caution needs to be exercised.
Kami bilang nasa gobyerno na rin, iniisip lang namin yung kaligtasan ng aming mamayan. Ako ay hindi tumututol at hindi rin pumapayag, balanse lang. Iniisip ko rin kasi yung pangailangan ng nakararami, Basta, ang sa amin lang kahilingan yung aming kaligtasan, kasiguraduhan ng aking barangay, kapakanan ng aking mamamayan. Yun. Number 1 na yun. Tour guide, tricycle drivers, mga bangkeros, biyahe ng jeep. Siyempre yung mga maliliit na manininda, mga tindahan. Lahat yan, ang barangay, ang local government, lahat yan ay kumikita sa aming turismo. Baka magkaroon ng paghihina.
He has engaged with the government and relayed the fears of the residents. But he's also optimistic that the Duterte administration will protect the communities here.
Nagkaroon naman ng mga pag-uusap, marami naman naganap na pag-uusap. Kaya ayos naman, may mga sinabi sila na hindi naman lulubog at hindi rin kami maapektuhan kasi nga may level na ng tubig na hanggang dun lang na hindi lulubog yung tinipak. Siguro sa mga ganong senaryo, walang dahilan para ako tumutol, At ligtas naman yung mamamayan ko, yung kabuhayan nila, ari-arian, ligtas, wala namang problema dun. Kasi, para sa kapakanan din na nakararami. Kasi yung water interruption sa Metro Manila, andyan na nga Hindi naman siguro magagawa yan kung hindi talaga tayo nagkukulang. Kaya, siguro, parang pumapayag na talaga,
But for environmentalist Leon Dulce, the benefits of the dam could outweigh the costs. As an activist of the People's Network for the Environment, Leon fights for the rights of the marginalized people. The China-backed Kaliwa Dam that could submerge land and livelihoods may only be a stopgap solution to Manila's water scarcity. Its impact is far-reaching.
From the ground zero of Kaliwa Dam downstream towards lower land areas in Rizal and then further downstream to Metro Manila are already susceptible to a lot of flood risk. So it's basically a Pandora's box of various threats to the people and to the planet. I don't think it's a healthy relationship, this relationship between Duterte and China. It's a very toxic relationship that results in the victimization of the Filipino people.
The Kaliwa Dam is located in the ancestral land, ancestral domain of the indigenous people. For thousands of years, they are living in the mountains. They depend their livelihood in the forests and the streams and the rivers of the mountains. All this will be eradicated by Kaliwa Dam. And what would happen to our indigenous people? Plenty of them, the indigenous people, they were saying no to Kaliwa Dam. If you put up Kaliwa Dam, you put death on our people.
Marcelino Tena is the leader of the Association of Indigenous Tribes in Infanta. The dam could displace the tribal community from their ancestral land. The government's promise of relocation offers no comfort to him.
Pero ang totoo, kung mahalaga sa amin ang pabahay, hindi kami sanay na mga katutubo sa pabahay. Dahil ang pabahay, ang relocation sa aming mga katutubo ay hindi tahanan, kundi ito ay magsisilbing bilangguan o libingan naming mga katutubo. Dahil kaming mga katutubo ay sanay na malaya na kumikilo sa loob ng aming lupaing ninuno, pangalagaan ng kalikasan, kaulayaw namin ang kagubatan at katubigan na yan. Kaya Kung yung usapin ng aming kalayaan, yun ang aming hinahangad ng mga katutubo.
For Marcelino, the dam is not just destroying the tribe's ancestral land, it's also ruining relationships.
Nasisira na rin yung pagiging magkakamag-anakan namin. Kahit magkapatid ngayon, nag-aaway na. Kahit mag-ama o magbiyanan, nag-aaway-aaway na yung magkakamag-anakan dahil doon sa ginagawang dam na yan. Dahil ang nangyayari, siyempre, mahihirap kami mga katutubo. May ilan na mga katutubo na hindi unawa yung kalagayan na pwede nilang, kumbaga, sasabihin, susuhulan nila na kung saan mapapapayag. Kaya doon sa isang banda ngayon, pag may nasuhulan, away na no, magkakamag-anakan.
While Chinese loans appear to be attractive, experts say that the loans are more expensive with higher interest rates than the ones from Japan. China has a pattern of funding infrastructure projects in poorer countries in exchange for regional access, a trend called debt trap diplomacy. The Philippines had other options to choose from, options that meant less destruction to the environment or people's livelihoods.
Profit is always the bottom line, and that's why they choose to pursue the Kaliwa Dam project. For instance, the Japan proposal entails a smaller amount of financing and definitely restoration of the rainforest and small-scale projects like microhydro and rainwater harvesting are not going to entail huge amounts of budget of financing. We run the risk of giving up all of these resources to China should we default on the loans that we are going to receive from them. No? And the risks are high. The risks of default is high.
Philippines can look elsewhere. China should, for the Philippines and for all Southeast Asian states, be perhaps a necessary but insufficient part of any development strategy. China's aid is not sufficient for all of their needs. In most cases, Chinese aid investment is still not the largest, right? If you are driving across a bridge in Southeast Asia or riding on a rail, particularly in the Philippines, it's almost certainly built by the Japanese, not the Chinese. The narrative that everything being built in South Asia is being built by China is invented by China because it creates diplomatic benefits for Beijing to pretend that it is the economic, black hole that nobody can escape.
Unlike other loans, say from Japan or South Korea, those agreements specifically provide that there would be compliance with our requirements for social actability, meaning that the local communities would sign off on these projects as well, not just national government. But the Chinese loan agreement does not provide for that. And so I think the intention was to simply go ahead and build these things without regard for its impact on the local communities.
A large-scale Chinese investment is also viewed as a Trojan horse. In the Philippines, Chinese-owned contractors are required to work on the infrastructure projects rather than supporting local companies and workers, thus benefiting China more than the Philippines. The projects were expected to generate more than 21,000 jobs. Concerns are growing as this has not materialized.
Chinese nationals have increased their investments in the Philippines, and some of the investors have to hire their own people, And if you will look at the numbers, it's not very high, We're talking only about 80,000 to 100,000 Chinese nationals getting alien employment permits and even temporary working permits. So that's very low compared to the overall labor population of the Philippines.
It's really the Chinese companies and workers benefiting, not the Philippine people. And now with the COVID-19 crisis and the slowdown in Chinese economy, I also doubt that China is in a position to throw out money and do all of these white elephant projects it has been doing, let's say in Pakistan or in Malaysia or in African countries in Latin America over the past few years.
Has there been consultation in this Kaliwa Dam, especially the people involved that will be affected by Kaliwa Dam. Mr. President, you rule because of the people, and you're supposed to rule for the good of the people. You promise as President to protect the sovereignty of our country. Do you think Kaliwa Dam is protecting our sovereignty? For me, this is a betrayal of the people, betrayal of the trust of the people, and betrayal of our Constitution.
In August 2020, a new territorial spat hit the headlines in the Philippines. The Duterte administration filed a diplomatic protest after Chinese forces seized fishing equipment from Filipino fishermen in the disputed Scarborough Shoal in the South China Sea, an area claimed by both the Philippines and China.
We have seen further militarization of the disputes. We have seen what I call militiaization of the disputes, with China deploying paramilitary forces surrounding and swarming Philippine-occupied islands like Fito Island, a large island that the Philippines has been occupying with civilians and military personnel since the 1970s.
The Philippines protested what it called China's continuing illicit issuances of radio challenges to Philippine aircraft conducting legitimate regular maritime patrols. Chinese incursions and military exercises in contested parts of the strategic waterway are seen as provocative, not just by the countries in the region, but also by the United States and allies.
The shoal has become the symbol, really, of the Philippine-China maritime disputes. And that's because the shoal is so close to Manila. The impact of the taking of the shoal is also, in a way, much more visceral for the public. No? It really catches public imagination. Scarborough Shoal is really the last piece of a puzzle for China in its quest for taking control of the South China Sea. And this is another reason why the shoal itself has become a symbol for the Philippine-China maritime disputes.
China sees, historically it was in control essentially of that maritime territory. That's its view, its famous 9-dash lines. China wants to return to how it was hundreds of years ago, when it was really the dominant force of the maritime area. Linked with that, of course, is their pride in what they see as their territory. For most countries, what they want to do is ensure that we maintain freedom of navigation and that no superpower is completely dominant in the South China Sea.
Yung mga Chinese pinaalis na kami ng ayaw na nila kami mangisda doon. Sa kanila daw yun. Siyempre, natakot kami may mga baril na sila time na yun. Oo, tinaboy kami yung binabangga pa nila yung cutting ng bangka namin, yung career namin na pinilit kami papaalisin.
A trip to Scarborough Shoal is something that Federico looks forward to. It's an area abundant with fish. A 3-month fishing expedition to the shoal can fetch him nearly 3 times more income than if he were to fish in the municipal waters of Masinloc, where he lives. But every time he ventures out into the shoal, he knows he has to encounter armed Chinese coast guards.
Nabigla kami mga alas 9 ng umaga. Mag-10. Tapos sabi nila, alis na kayo. Hindi namin maintindihan inchik ang salita nila. Hindi naman sila makakaintindi ng English. Yung lang yung helicopter lang ang maririnig namin na yung nag-English yung parang naka-record naka-record siya sa ano, all Filipino fishing go. Yun lang, pabalik-balik. Dalawang helicopter dyan sa tapat namin.
And they're violating the rights of our fishermen. This is a gross human rights violations, not only a violation of our territorial and maritime rights. I think from a rhetorical standpoint, it has done its job and it kept the issue alive. And that's why Duterte is having a hard time. He has been having a hard time to give concessions to China, including on joint development agreement in areas that fall within the 9-dash line.
Nandun na yun, ma'am, pamubuli, ganun na yun. Siyempre, lagi kang kinukuhaan ng isda. O, ano pang ibig sabihin nun? Pang-aapi, pang-bubuli na yun. Ganun na yun. Sana, ma'am, magbago na. Katulad ng ganitong sitwasyon na parang pinipilit mo parang ninanakaw mo yung sarili mong sa Scarborough. Parang nagnanakaw doon. Sarili mo namang lugar yun.
China's Coast Guard routinely warns foreign planes and vessels passing through and over international waters. After the Philippines accused them of illegally seizing fishing equipment, China's foreign ministry defended their Coast Guard and accused the Philippines instead.
中国海警在中国黄岩岛海域依法开展执法活动，无可厚非。非方派军机侵入中国南沙驻守岛礁邻近的空域，损害了中方主权和安全。中方敦促非方立即停止非法挑衅活动。
Things are not improving, and as we saw last year, an incident happened in the Reed Bank where 22 Filipino fishermen almost drowned and died when a Chinese suspected militia vessel just rammed into them in the middle of the night. So that incident really drove home the fact that Duterte's China policy has been a massive failure. He's not getting any concession from China, and China is ramping up its presence in Philippine waters.
The Duterte's administration's protest against China also comes against the backdrop of a simmering debate in the Philippines over the president's pivot to China policy. Several top Philippine officials have publicly complained about the backlog in promised Chinese projects. There's also been public pressure to take a tougher stance on China.
I think Duterte is, I would say, tweaking his foreign policy. A few months ago, it looked like there was a major recalibration of his shift towards Beijing and that he was moving more firmly back towards a sort of pro-US position, or at least a more ambiguous position. What we're not seeing is Duterte totally giving up his pivot to Beijing. I think ideologically, Duterte is still very pro-Beijing, pro-Moscow. He's sort of a Cold War ideologue.
I think that Rodrigo Duterte is responding to the fact that his China policy has abjectly failed for the last 4.5 years. He is not any more pro-American today than he was when he took office in 2016. I doubt he's any more anti-China. But the fact is that there was an implicit deal between him and China in 2016 that he would push the Americans to arm's length and keep quiet on the South China Sea in exchange for money. He needed loans, investment aid, and none of that showed up. And so now he realizes that if he keeps this up, it only makes him look weak, it damages his political brand, and it hurts his successor, whoever he decides to anoint for the 2022 presidential run.
The Filipino fishing community has expressed concerns that Chinese fishermen are engaged in the mass harvesting of precious clams from the Philippine-claimed Scarborough Shoal.
There will be some consequences if China will not pay attention to our sensitivities and to our red lines. That's why we are pushing hard for the conclusion of the Code of Conduct in the South China Sea. And that is why also we're talking with China bilaterally to have some sort of joint fishery management in the area, if not in the whole South China Sea area, but at least in the Scarborough Shoal.
To be frank, I really do not understand his subservience to Chinese interests. You can assert Filipino interest without being subservient to the interest of the Chinese in the Philippines. As president, he swear under oath that he should be defending integrity of the Philippine territory. But I do not see that in the issue of the West Philippine Sea.
The issues surrounding the South China Sea have also contributed to the rise of an anti-China sentiment in the country. An ongoing controversy involves a friendship bridge to signify China-Philippines relations. It is being constructed in the historic center of Manila City. But for the Filipinos, it's a bridge that's burning bridges.
We find it superfluous that the government would want to build a bridge in between two bridges.
Binondo Intramuros Bridge, also called the Friendship Bridge, is at the heart of the historic center of Manila. It's also at the heart of a heated controversy in the Philippines.
Why would you construct another bridge between two bridges when in fact you can retrofit the existing bridges? If you want goods to flow easier, why not make the Delpan Bridge a bit wider so that it could also accommodate these big vans coming from the port area?
The bridge is a gift to the Duterte government to ease Manila's traffic congestion. Heritage conservationists like Maria have been opposing the construction, built with a $76 million Chinese grant. It can threaten their bid to the UNESCO to make the Intramuros area into a World Heritage Site.
As a heritage worker, it's better to preserve what is existing. It's a historic district and many of the structures in the area have been there for centuries. So why not preserve this? These churches are examples of earthquake Baroque churches, meaning to say the architecture might be European, it might be of Baroque architecture, but it was constructed to withstand the frequent earthquakes that strike the Philippines. So it's a showcase of Filipino ingenuity.
There's considerable public resentment against not just the infrastructure projects, but also against the growing influx of Chinese into the country. Chinese immigrants, including many employees of Chinese offshore gambling operations, are believed to push up rents and other costs, forcing locals out and arousing racial hostility. But what continued to hit a raw nerve and inflame passions are the maritime spats between China and the Philippines.
Kasi po, malaking diferensya po yun kasi hindi naman sila makakapunta ng Scarborough, itong mga pumupunta. Siyempre, pati kaming taga-tinda po, may impiktahan din kami dahil wala kaming kikitahin din.
Ernesto runs a small fish stall in the coastal town of Masinloc. Fish from Scarborough fetch a high price and are in demand. When fishermen are banned from going to Scarborough, sellers like him lose a sizable chunk of their businesses and therefore incomes.
President Duterte, dapat pakiusapan po niya yung China para magkapyahan sila para maayos ang buhay ng Pilipina at saka China po. Yun lang ang gusto kong sabihin din.
Duterte was, I think, their best shot, really, at fundamentally reorienting the Philippines' foreign policy. And they didn't give much for Duterte to work with. And they did so much wrong in South China Sea that they really alienated a lot of Filipinos.
The South China Sea tension escalated in 2012 when Manila took the matter to the Permanent Court of Arbitration in The Hague. In 2016, the court ruled that China has no legal basis for its sweeping territorial claims over the entirety of the South China Sea. However, President Duterte has not enforced the historic ruling.
Pero yung sinasabi niya noon na malaya na ay hindi naman ganun kalaya dahil sa mayroon pa ring mga limitasyon yung pagpuntang mangisda doon sa nasabing lugar. Dahil ang mga Chinese Coast Guard ayaw pa rin magpapasok doon sa lugar. Nakakapangisda lang ang mga Filipino fishermen dito sa labas, sa paikot lang ng Scarborough. So pagka nangisda kami ron, minsan ang nangyayari pa, nilalapitan ng mga Chinese Coast Guard yung ating mga kasamang mangisda at kinukuha pa yung mga huli nila at binubuli pa. Sinasabi na pinapalabas na barter, papalitan daw kuno ng mga noodles, na kung ano-ano yung ipinapalit doon sa huling isda, pero hindi naman sapat yung mga ipinapalit nilang.
Duterte's view on the shoal and other South China Sea issues is partly driven by ideology, but it's also partly a sort of realpolitik view. I mean, his take is that yes, this is Philippine territory, but at the end of the day, the asymmetry of power between China and the Philippines is so great. So what does the Philippines have to gain by being very, very antagonistic to China? And in his view, it's better to try and have warmer relations, not let this issue disrupt broader bilateral ties, and try and boost the economic investment ties.
At sunod-sunuran siya kung ano lang yung nais ng Chinese government. At hindi siya makapag-decide na para, ito, bantayan mo yung nasabing lugar. So, ganun yung aking pananaw kasi napakatapang ng ating Pangulo. Kung magsalita siya, kung titignan natin, napakatapang kung magdesisyon siya. Pero yung sabi niya, walisin ang China diyan sa nasabing lugar, hindi niya masabing ganon. So, ang pananaw ko, tuta siya ng China. Kung talagang hindi siya tuta ng China, di sana sabihin niya, lubayas kayong lahat diyan ng Chino. Amin yan ng mga Pilipino.
The South China Sea is of immense strategic and geo-economic importance. 1/5 of global trade passes through it. China pushes for control of the disputed sea lanes as its economic security is closely tied to the South China Sea. But China's destructive activities in the region, like dredging to construct new islands and overfishing, are causing irreparable damage to the environment.
There are a lot of people who have tried in the last few years to put a number on how much damage China's caused to the marine environment in the South China Sea. And there was even still ongoing efforts to convince Filipinos to sue China for damages based on a number of things. However you slice it, the fact is that China has engaged in the largest intentional destruction of coral reef in the history of the world, and that it has done it in the world's most productive fishing grounds.
Their clam digging operations, which have been destroying the habitats on Scarborough Shoal because Chinese fishermen basically excavate coral reefs in order to get valuable giant clam shells, which they use as a substitute for ivory. No? And it's a very lucrative business in China. And it's only in China that this has become a real economic opportunity. China has continued to destroy Scarborough Shoal since 2012, and essentially the government turned a blind eye to this in order to present this atmosphere of friendliness and congeniality with China. I think that has become increasingly untenable.
So, is it time for President Duterte to change tack and rethink his China pivot strategy? Will Duterte be compelled by domestic pressures to move closer to the US by recalibrating his friendly relations with China?
So it has been a shambolic Chinese policy by Duterte. In theory, it makes sense for us to play the superpowers against each other and get concessions from both sides. Most Southeast Asian countries have been doing that. But that presupposes one thing. That presupposes strategic coherence and strategic maturity, if not astuteness. And that's exactly what we don't see in President Duterte.
I think he has already slightly recalibrated his policy during the pandemic. We've noticed that with the, reversing his early decision to cancel the US Security Pact, Visiting Forces Agreement. But we've also seen him make comments about, joint oil and gas exploration with China, being positive about that. It's hard to say this is a total recalibration. If his poll numbers start to dip slightly, he would take a more robust position towards China. If his poll numbers are high, as they are right now, then he tends to, revert to his more sort of ideological, natural position of being very pro-China.
I think the posturing will continue. He really will not be able to convince the people that his China policy has produced tangible benefits at this point. That's why he's still hoping that China would provide the Philippines with free vaccines for COVID-19. I think that's his last card that he can play in order to salvage his China policy.